Hi everybody. Okay, so we've already talked about how phrases and clauses are the building blocks of sentences, but we haven't talked about what a sentence actually is yet. So a sentence is a group of words that contain a verb and a subject. They express a complete thought, and they contain punctuation, like end marks, for example. An end mark would be a question mark, a period, or an exclamation point. The sentences have four functions. The first function is to declare something. So for example, I love coffee. The second function would be to ask a question, like, do you like coffee? Our third function may be to give a command, like, give me a cup of coffee. Or the fourth function would be to make an interjection, like, yikes. Don't worry so much about interjections at the moment. We are going to get to them in a separate module. Now, there are four different kinds of sentences that we can have. Sentences can be categorized in four different ways. The first kind that we're going to talk about are simple sentences. And simple sentences are basically just independent clauses with a subject and a verb. If you remember from our last segment on clauses, we talked about how independent clauses are basically just short sentences. So let's take a look at our first example. We have Jane eats pad thai. We have a subject and a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. This can stand alone. Now, simple sentences can also be made up of compound subjects and compound verbs. For example, Jane and Adam, a compound subject, cook and eat, a compound verb, pad thai. Now, we also have compound sentences. And a compound sentence is a sentence with two or more independent clauses. So let's take a look at the two examples that I have here. We have Jane loves pad thai, comma, but she hates fried grasshoppers. Now if you look here, you'll notice that I have two clauses, Jane loves pad thai and she hates fried grasshoppers, that can be completely independent of each other. So they're two, or they can be independent thoughts or independent sentences. They could actually be separated and still make sense on their own. They're joined together by the word but, and they're also joined together by a comma, okay? If you take a look at the next example, I'll sleep in the chair, or I can sleep on the floor. Again, we have two independent thoughts that can stand alone, separated by a comma in the word or. So oftentimes when we're separating compound sentences, we will use a comma unless one of the independent clauses is really small. For example, if I said that joke wasn't very funny, but he laughed. That joke wasn't very funny is an independent clause, and he laughed is also an independent clause. But because it's so small, we actually don't need a comma between the first independent clause and the second. So it would just read fluidly. That joke wasn't very funny, but he laughed without any comma at all, because the second independent clause is really small. Now let's take a look at complex sentences. A complex sentence is a sentence with at least one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. So let's take a look at a few examples. We have, when he fell asleep, someone stole all of his money. So if you look here, when he fell asleep would be our dependent clause. If I took this portion by itself and I just wrote when he fell asleep, it would beg the question of what happened. So therefore it's considered to be a dependent clause. The second clause is someone stole all of his money. Now this clause is an independent clause because it could stand by itself. If you notice here, we're joining the dependent clause to the independent clause with a comma. However, if you switch them around and you make the independent clause come first, you don't actually need a comma. So if you take a look, I switched these two around over here, and I wrote, someone stole all of his money when he fell asleep. And you'll notice that between the independent clause and the dependent clause, there is no comma, okay? So once the independent clause, or if the independent clause comes first, there doesn't have to be a comma to separate the independent clause and the dependent clause. If it's the other way around, if the dependent clause comes first and the independent clause comes second, then we do need a comma in there. Let's take a look at the second example that I have. Because he only had bug spray left, comma, he decided to sleep on the beach again. Again, because he only had bug spray left is my dependent clause. He decided to sleep on the beach again is an independent clause that can stand by itself. So like I said, here, because the dependent clause comes first, I have a comma separating the two. But over here, on this side, he decided to sleep on the beach again because he only had bug spray left. I don't need a comma because the dependent clause comes last. By the way, this is actually a true story about a friend of mine, just in case you were wondering. The last kind of sentence that we're going to talk about is called a compound complex sentence. And they're sentences with two independent clauses, so that would be the compound part, and at least one dependent clause, and that would be the complex part. So let's take a look at the example that I have here. When he woke up, he realized that they had stolen his bug spray and they had also taken his cigarettes. So when he woke up would be the dependent clause because it can't stand on its own. He realized that they had stolen his bug spray. This could be an independent clause because it would be able to stand on its own and make sense. And they had also taken his cigarettes will be the second independent clause. So I hope that this clarifies sentences for you in all 4 different kinds of sentences that we have here.